And for analysis on the boat incident near Cuba and U.S. oil sanctions on the country, we're pleased to welcome national security analyst Rebecca Grant. She's also the vice president of the Lexington Institute. Rebecca, thanks for joining this morning. As we just saw, Secretary of State Marco Rubio describing the boat incident as highly unusual, and Florida's AG there saying that Cuba has already changed their story multiple times. What do you think is actually happening in this incident?
Well, this is highly unusual. There have, over the years, been instances of the Cubans shooting first and asking questions later. But this story just gets crazier with every turn. We've learned, I think, that the boat was stolen from the Florida Keys. It's not a large boat, as Representative Jimenez told us. The Cubans, of course, are trying to make this out to be some mini invasion or terrorist act, but that's just ridiculous. I expect to see Florida and, of course, the State Department really trying to get to the bottom of who these people were, what happened, and then, of course, what has happened to the rest of the crew that may still be in Cuba. It is, however, a crazy incident. And I think one thing is very clear, that this was not backed or planned in any way by the U.S. government.
Now, this happens amidst a whole bunch of issues, one being, of course, the Ukraine-Russia negotiations. Russia speaking out on this issue, you would think that they have no knowledge of it, being, very far from the Caribbean area. But they did bring up the humanitarian issues of Cuban citizens. Where might Russia fit into the Cuban regime's attempt to survive now that the U.S. has essentially reasserted the Monroe Doctrine and sanctioned all of the oil and, really put the screws, if you will, to the communist regime?
Yes, well, that's Russia for you. Any chance to jump on the propaganda. And of course, they know nothing about what was going on. I mean, Secretary of State Rubio was actually in the Caribbean when this incident occurred. But they'll lose no chance to put out their propaganda. And sadly, some people are kind of believing this. The Cuban government wants this narrative that the oil sanctions are oppressive and it's not humanitarian. I think President Trump and Secretary Rubio see the oil sanctions as part of the economic pressure on Cuba. That terrible regime, 100 miles from the best economy, the best country in the world, the United States, and there is Cuba continuing to suffer. Now, Rubio's also made pretty clear in his remarks after this incident that there's not military action imminent. They are trying to do an economic squeeze on the Cuban regime. And as you said, that includes oil. Cuba was getting about 100,000 barrels a day of oil, and now that has greatly, greatly diminished. And they're out of aviation gas, jet fuel.
And Rebecca, to pan back a bit, since you are an expert, of course, in matters specific to Russia as well as foreign policy in general, after Maduro's capture, both Cuba and Iran clearly weakened by the U.S. sanctions that have been happening. And then you take away the Venezuelan oil. India also agreed to stop buying Russian gas products. How does that put pressure on Russia and potentially China in terms of the peace process with Ukraine?
Well, putting oil pressure on Russia is what, everybody wants. The administration would love to see that. Unfortunately, they have to drive the price per barrel down pretty low. And Russia's done a good job of continuing to ship oil through its shadow fleet. Venezuela was involved in that. Iran was involved in that as well, as they ship their oil partly via a shadow fleet that China purchases. So it kind of all does come back to China. The major purchaser there had been for Venezuela, still is for Russia, still is for Iran. It's really hard to put sanctions and squeeze Russia when China is continuing to backstop everything, and China is also continuing to purchase from Iran and to ship Iran chemicals to build ballistic missile rocket fuel. Pretty tough.
And the song kind of remains the same ultimately with Iran and their negotiations. Cuba, these regimes certainly don't cede control. What do you think happens over the next month or two as it relates to those two particular regimes?
And they're similar in that they've both been around a long time. They're terrible for their people. I mean, you can't imagine two worse economies than Cuba and Iran. But they are basically like mafia families. They're doing this to stay in power. We hate to see it. And that's why this complex economic pressure is there to try to get to a solution without military action. But Certainly, President Trump is ready for military action against Iran, to pressure that regime to agree to get rid of its nuclear enriched fuel that it shouldn't keep and to limit its programs. If that doesn't work, I think we see a strike. With Cuba, I think right now the policy is to continue the economic squeeze. But you know that a change in Cuba is a high priority for Secretary Marco Rubio.
And Rebecca, just in our last 30 seconds, your thoughts on the upcoming meetings. Obviously, Witkoff and Kushner met with Ukraine yesterday, but what might be the next material milestone toward any peace in Russia?
Witkoff and Kushner will keep at it. It's still about a land agreement. There's a great economic prosperity deal for Ukraine in the offing, so Ukraine will say yes, but it's all about getting Putin to say yes to a ceasefire, and sadly, Putin loves that war.
Yeah. More to come on that, of course. We always appreciate your analysis. Thanks, Rebecca Grant.
Thank you.